When Julia adopted Bronx, a majestic German shepherd, from the local shelter, she thought she was gaining a loving companion. What she didn't know was that this act of kindness would put her in a race against time to save her own life. As Bronx snuggled into her bed each night, Julia had no idea that each tender hug brought her closer to unseen danger. A rare and potentially fatal disease was spreading silently, defying diagnosis and threatening to destroy the special bond between a woman and her dog. The shelter was an old red brick building, with excited barks echoing from inside. Julia entered, immediately enveloped by the distinctive smell of animals and disinfectant. She walked slowly through the halls, observing dogs of all sizes and colors, each with their own story of abandonment and hope. It was then that she saw him. In one of the last kennels, a majestic German shepherd with black and gold fur stared at her with deep, intelligent eyes. There was something in his gaze, a mix of strength and vulnerability, that touched Julia deeply. "This is the Bronx," said Sarah, the shelter worker, approaching with a warm smile. "He's been with us for a few weeks. He was found wandering the streets without a collar or microchip." Julia knelt in front of the kennel, carefully extending her hand. Bronx came closer, sniffing his fingers before giving a gentle lick. It was at that moment that Julia knew. This was her dog. The adoption process was surprisingly quick. Before she knew it, Julia was signing papers and receiving instructions on basic care, nutrition, and the importance of regular veterinary checkups. "He's already vaccinated and neutered," Sarah explained, handing Julia a folder with documents. "But it's always a good idea to have a full checkup with your vet in the next few weeks." With Bronx at her side, tethered by a shiny new collar, Julia emerged from the shelter feeling as if she were floating. The drive home was an adventure in itself, with Bronx sniffing every fire hydrant and tree, his eyes shining with the excitement of exploring his new world. Julia's small apartment on the 4th floor of a walk-up building suddenly seemed much smaller with the Bronx's imposing presence. But she didn't care. She quickly began rearranging the furniture, creating a cozy space in the corner of the room with a soft bed and new toys. "Welcome to your new home, Bronx," Julia said, stroking the dog's soft ears. That first night, Julia prepared a special dinner for both of them, a juicy piece of grilled chicken for Bronx and a fresh salad for herself. As they ate, she couldn't help but notice how Bronx's presence had already transformed her once lonely apartment into a true home. When it was time for bed, Julia showed Bronx her new bed in the living room. The dog sniffed around, walked around a few times, and finally settled down, his eyes fixed on Julia as she headed toward the bedroom. "Good night, buddy," she whispered, gently closing the door. However, when Julia woke up the next morning, she was in for a surprise. Bronx was lying next to her on the bed, his warm, furry body pressed against her, breathing deeply and rhythmically. Julia laughed, shaking her head in admiration at her new companion's cunning. "You're a smart-ass, aren't you?" she murmured, stroking Bronx's soft fur. In the days that followed, Julia tried to set boundaries, always taking Bronx back to his bed in the living room. But invariably, she woke up with the dog by her side. In time, she surrendered, enchanted by Bronx's devotion and affection. Little did Julia know that this closeness, this deep bond that was forming between them, would soon be tested in ways she could never imagine. The journey that had begun with a simple desire for companionship was about to turn into a fight for survival, testing the limits of love between a woman and her dog. Weeks passed, and Julia's life fell into a comfortable routine with Bronx. Long walks in the park in the morning, work sessions at home with Bronx lying at your feet, and cozy evenings watching movies on the couch. Julia felt like she had found the missing piece in her life. However, as summer approached, Julia began to notice subtle changes in her body. What started as mild fatigue soon turned into an overwhelming tiredness that no amount of coffee or nights of sleep seemed to dispel. Your mornings, once energetic and productive, have become a fight against the alarm clock. Must be the stress of work, Julia muttered to herself one day as she dragged herself out of bed, ignoring the warning signals her body was sending. After all, she had tight deadlines and demanding clients. There was no time to be sick, but as the days turned into weeks, her symptoms worsened. The simple act of climbing the stairs to her apartment, once a routine task, became an ordeal that left her breathless and dizzy. His skin, normally clear and healthy, took on a worrying pallor. Bronx, always attentive, seemed to sense that something was wrong. He became more protective, rarely leaving Julia's side, his eyes filled with canine concern. Finally, after almost fainting during a meeting with an important client, Julia gave in and made an appointment with her doctor, Dr. Thompson. Dr. Thompson's office was a familiar place, with its soft-toned walls and distinctive smell of antiseptic. The doctor, a middle-aged man with thin-rimmed glasses and a gentle smile, listened intently as Julia described her symptoms. "When did this start, Julia?" Dr. Thompson asked, making notes in his chart. Julia hesitated, her mind going back to the last few weeks. I'm not sure. Maybe a month after adopting my dog, Bronx." The doctor raised his eyebrows, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. After a series of blood tests and allergy tests, he came to a surprising conclusion. "Julia," he said, leaning forward in his chair, eyes serious behind his glasses, "I believe you may have developed an allergy to your new dog." The shock went through Julia like a bolt of lightning. Dog allergy? She, who has always loved animals and never had problems before. It seemed impossible, almost cruel. But given the doctor's insistence and the lack of other explanations, she accepted the prescription of anti-allergy medication and the recommendation to stay away from the Bronx. With a heavy heart, Julia returned home, the doctor's words echoing in her mind. How could she keep her distance from Bronx, her faithful companion? The idea of parting with him, even temporarily, seemed unbearable. That night, with tears in her eyes, Julia tried to explain the situation to Bronx. "I'm so sorry, buddy," she whispered, stroking his soft ears. "We need to make some changes for a while." Julia reorganized her apartment, creating a Bronx-free zone in her bedroom. Heartbroken, she convinced Bronx to sleep outside the room, feeling a pang of guilt every time she saw his sad eyes through the crack in the door. For a few days, Julia felt a slight improvement. Her breathing became less labored, and she had a little more energy. But the joy of this improvement was quickly overshadowed by the sadness of being separated from the Bronx. However, the improvement was short-lived. Soon the symptoms returned with full force, accompanied by new and worrying signs. Julia began having intermittent fevers and joint pain that left her groaning in pain. His work began to suffer severely. Projects that she once completed with ease now seemed like insurmountable mountains. She found herself missing deadlines and disappointing clients, on the verge of losing the job she loved so much. Desperate for answers and feeling increasingly worse, Julia shared her situation with a veterinarian friend, Dr. Melissa, over lunch. Melissa listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. When Julia finished speaking, the veterinarian slowly shook her head. "Julia, that doesn't sound like a simple allergy," she said, concern evident in her voice. "There's something else going on here. Let's run some tests in Bronx. Maybe he can give us some clues about what's going on with you." Reluctantly, but with no other options, Julia agreed. The next day, she took Bronx to the veterinary clinic, her heart heavy with worry not only for herself, but also for her faithful companion. The days that followed were an agony of waiting and worry. Julia alternated between moments of hope and despair as her health continued to deteriorate. Bronx, always sensitive to his owner's mood, remained constantly at her side, offering silent comfort. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the call came. Melissa's voice was tense on the other end of the line, and Julia felt her heart race with anticipation. "Julia," Melissa began, her voice deep, "we discovered something. Bronx has brucellosis, a rare bacterial disease, and I'm afraid you may have contracted it from her." Melissa's words fell like a weight on Julia. Brucellosis. A disease she had never heard of was threatening her life and that of her beloved Bronx. At that moment, Julia realized that her journey with Bronx was far from over. In fact, the real battle was just beginning.